Welcome, dear listeners, to this cozy audiobook adventure, A Cup of Poison, Miss Marple's Deadly Tea Time. I'm delighted you've joined me for a tale of gentle intrigue set in the quaint English village of St. Mary Mead. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, we'll follow the sharp-eyed Miss Jane Marple as she unravels a puzzling mystery over cups of tea and village gossip. Settle in with your favorite brew, relax, and let the story unfold. This audiobook is divided into 5 chapters for your enjoyment. And now, without further ado, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Tea. In the tranquil village of St. Mary Mead, tucked away in the verdant folds of 1950s England, time seemed to dawdle like a contented cat. The thatched cottages, their gardens bursting with roses and hollyhocks, lined the winding lanes like a picture from a storybook. The church spire pierced the soft autumn sky, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and freshly turned earth. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and secrets, though carefully guarded, had a way of whispering themselves through the hedgerows. At the heart of this idyllic scene lived Miss Jane Marple, a white-haired spinster whose unassuming demeanor belied a mind as sharp as her knitting needles. Her modest cottage on the edge of the village green was a hub of quiet observation. From her window, she watched the comings and goings of St. Mary Mead with the keen interest of a naturalist studying a rare species. People are much the same everywhere, she often remarked to her nephew, Raymond West, her blue eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. And yet, it's the small things, the way a person stirs their tea or avoids another's glance, that tell you everything. On a crisp October afternoon, as leaves drifted lazily from the ancient oaks, Miss Marple was tending her garden, her gloved hands coaxing a late-blooming chrysanthemum into shape. The postman, young Tommy Pierce, pedaled up with a cheery wave and handed her a cream-colored envelope embossed with the vicarage crest. "Tea party, tomorrow, Miss Marple," he called, Mrs. Clements pulling out all the stops. Miss Marple smiled, unfolding the invitation. The Reverend Leonard Clement and his lively young wife Griselda were hosting a harvest tea at the vicarage, a tradition that drew the village's most notable figures. The guest list, as Griselda's scrawled note revealed, included Colonel Lucius Prothero, the gruff, wealthy occupant of Old Hall, his adopted daughter Lettice, a dreamy girl of 20, Raymond West, Miss Marple's own nephew who was visiting from London, Mrs. Price Ridley, the village's self-appointed arbiter of gossip, and Anne, the vicarage maid, who would serve the tea. "How delightful," Miss Marple murmured, though her brow furrowed slightly. "Though I do wonder about Colonel Prothero. He's been rather prickly of late." Indeed, the colonel was a figure of contention in St. Mary Mead, a retired military man with a bristling mustache and a temper to match. He wielded his wealth and influence like a cudgel. Recently, he'd clashed with nearly everyone invited to the tea. Raymond, a struggling writer, had argued with his uncle over a dwindling allowance, his dreams of literary fame hanging by a thread. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose garden bordered Old Hall, was incensed over a disputed fence line, claiming the colonel had stolen half her rose beds. Lettice, though outwardly demure, chafed under her adoptive father's strict rules, particularly his disapproval of her suitor, Lawrence Redding, a bohemian artist. Even Anne, the quiet maid, had been overheard in a heated exchange with the colonel, something about unpaid wages and a broken vase. As Miss Marple snipped a wilted stem, she reflected on these tensions. "It's like a tangle of wool," she thought. "One must pull gently to see where the knots lie." She tucked the invitation into her apron and resolved to observe closely at the tea party. Human nature, after all, had a way of revealing itself in the clink of teacups and the flicker of a glance. The following afternoon, the vicarage drawing-room was a picture of cozy elegance. Lace curtains filtered the golden sunlight, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. A long table, draped in crisp white linen, groaned under the weight of Griselda's preparations. Silver teapots steaming with Earl Grey, platters of scones with clotted cream, and delicate cucumber sandwiches. Griselda herself flitted about, her auburn curls bouncing as she greeted guests with her infectious laugh. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're here!" she exclaimed, clasping the older woman's hands. "Isn't it marvelous? Everyone's come." Miss Marple settled into a chintz armchair by the window, her knitting bag at her feet. She wore a simple lavender dress and her favorite brooch, a cameo that gleamed softly in the light. From her vantage point, she could see the entire room. The vicar, Leonard, adjusting his spectacles as he chatted with Raymond. Lettuce, in a pale blue frock, pouring milk into her tea with a trembling hand. Mrs. Price Ridley, her lips pursed as she surveyed the spread with a critical eye. And Anne, moving silently among the guests, her dark hair neatly pinned under a white cap. Colonel Prothero arrived last, his heavy footsteps announcing his presence before he appeared in the doorway. His face was flushed, his gray mustache quivering with irritation. "Damned nuisance, these affairs," he muttered, accepting a cup from Anne with a curt nod. "Can't abide all this chatter." He sank into a chair near the fireplace, his large frame dwarfing the delicate furniture. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically as she observed the room. Raymond, she noted, fidgeted with his cufflinks, avoiding his uncle's gaze. Mrs. Price Ridley shot the colonel a venomous look when she thought no one was watching. Lettuce, seated near Griselda, seemed distracted, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting someone. And Anne, poor Anne, moved with the careful precision of someone trying not to be noticed. Curious, Miss Marple thought. So many undercurrents in such a small gathering. The conversation flowed as smoothly as the tea, with Griselda steering it toward harvest festival plans, and the vicar reminiscing about last year's bountiful crop. But beneath the pleasantries, tension simmered. Colonel Prothero, never one for tact, interrupted Mrs. Price Ridley's anecdote about her prize marrows. "Stuff and nonsense," he snapped. "Your garden's a mess, woman, and that fence is mine by rights." Mrs. Price Ridley flushed scarlet, her teacup rattling in its saucer. Now, the vicar interjected, his voice soothing. "Let's enjoy the afternoon, shall we?" He offered the colonel a plate of scones, which was declined with a grunt. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly as she watched Anne refill the colonel's cup. He requested extra sugar, and Anne obliged, dropping 2 lumps into his tea with the silver tongs. The gesture was ordinary, yet something about it caught Miss Marple's attention. The slight hesitation in Anne's fingers, perhaps, or the way the colonel stirred his tea with unusual vigor. The afternoon wore on, filled with laughter and the clink of china. Griselda regaled the group with tales of her latest decorating mishaps, and even Raymond managed a wry smile as he recounted a failed poetry reading in London. But the mood shifted abruptly when Colonel Prothero set down his cup with a clatter. His hand flew to his throat, his face contorting in pain. "Poison," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "It's poison." His eyes, wide with accusation, swept the room before he slumped forward, lifeless, onto the rug. Gasps filled the air. Griselda screamed, dropping her teacup. The vicar rushed to the colonel's side, but it was no use. Colonel Prothero was dead. Anne stood frozen, the teapot trembling in her hands. Mrs. Price Ridley clutched her shawl, muttering, "Good heavens!" Raymond stared, pale as chalk, while Lettice let out a sob. Miss Marple, calm amid the chaos, folded her knitting and rose. "Dear me," she said softly, her voice steady. "How very like that dreadful business in Chipping Cleghorn." She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the spilled tea, the scattered sugar lumps, the horrified faces. The village constable was summoned, and soon the room buzzed with his questions. "Arsenic, I'd wager," he said grimly, eyeing the teacup. "We'll need the doctor to confirm." As the guests were ushered out, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze lingering on the sugar bowl. "Sugar can hide so much," she murmured to herself. "A bitter taste, indeed." She slipped out into the twilight, the weight of the mystery settling over her like a familiar shawl. St. Mary Mead, it seemed, was no stranger to secrets, and Miss Marple knew that unraveling them would require all her quiet wisdom. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Village. The death of Colonel Lucius Prothero cast a shadow over St. Mary Mead as if the autumn sun had dimmed behind a sudden cloud. By dusk, the news had spread from the vicarage to every corner of the village, carried on the wings of whispers and hurried footsteps. In the cozy cottages and the bustling post office, voices hushed with speculation. The church bells, usually a comforting chime, seemed to toll with a mournful weight. St. Mary Mead, so accustomed to the gentle rhythm of daily life, was now gripped by the chill of murder. Miss Jane Marple, unruffled as ever, sat in her sitting room that evening, her knitting needles clicking like a metronome. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow on her neat parlor, where lace doilies adorned every surface, and a vase of late roses perfumed the air. She had declined to join the throng at the vicarage, where Inspector Slack, a brusque man from the nearby town of Much Benham, was interrogating the tea-party guests. Instead, she pondered the afternoon's events, her mind sifting through the details like a gardener turning soil. "A cup of poison," she mused aloud, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames. So simple, yet so deliberate. Someone in that room knew exactly what they were doing. The following morning, Miss Marple accepted Griselda's invitation to return to the vicarage for a quiet cup of tea. "Unpoisoned," Griselda assured with a nervous laugh. The vicarage, once a haven of warmth, now felt like a stage where a tragedy had unfolded. The drawing-room's lace curtains hung limply, and the Persian rug bore a faint stain where the colonel's teacup had spilled. Griselda, her usual vivacity subdued, poured tea with trembling hands. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple," she said, her voice quavering. "Who could have done such a thing? Right here, in our home. Leonard's beside himself, and the village won't stop talking." Miss Marple patted Griselda's hand, her own steady, as she accepted a cup. "My dear, people will talk, but talk often reveals more than it hides. Now tell me, did you notice anything odd yesterday? Before the incident?" Griselda frowned, her auburn curls falling across her forehead. "I was so busy playing hostess, but, well, Raymond seemed awfully jumpy, didn't he? Kept tugging at his cuffs. And Mrs. Price Ridley was glaring at the colonel like she'd like to poison him herself." Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. "Indeed. And young Raymond, did you see him touch his teacup after the colonel drank? I thought not. And Mrs. Price Ridley's fondness for gardening poisons came up at the Women's Institute last week, didn't it? Arsenic for rats, she said." Griselda's eyes widened. "You don't think?" "I think very little, my dear, until I know more. Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile, "but I do observe, and observation is half the battle." Inspector Slack had set up a temporary headquarters in the vicarage study, his notebook bristling with scribbled notes. He interviewed the suspects with a brisk efficiency that Miss Marple found rather hasty. She lingered in the hall, ostensibly to admire Griselda's new curtains, but her ears caught snatches of conversation. Raymond West, the colonel's nephew, was first. "Uncle was cutting me off," he admitted, his voice sullen. "Said I was a layabout, wasting his money on poetry nonsense. But I didn't poison him. I was out in the garden, smoking, when it happened." Miss Marple, passing by, noted the faint scent of cigarette ash on his jacket, a detail she tucked away. Mrs. Price Ridley, next in line, was indignant. "That man accused me of stealing his roses. A fence dispute, nothing more. Poison, preposterous." Yet Miss Marple recalled her boasting about her garden shed, stocked with all manner of pest controls, including arsenic. "So useful for those pesky rodents," Mrs. Price Ridley had said, her eyes glinting with pride. Lettice Protheroe, the colonel's adopted daughter, wept delicately into a lace handkerchief. "Father was so strict," she told the inspector. "He forbade my engagement to Lawrence Redding, said he wasn't good enough." Her alibi was chatting with Griselda about Paris fashions, confirmed by the vicar's wife. But Miss Marple noticed how Lettice's fingers twisted the handkerchief, as if strangling a secret. Anne, the vicarage maid, was last, her face pale as she faced the inspector. "I served the tea, yes, but I didn't poison it," she protested. "The colonel was cross about a broken vase, threatened to sack me, but I'd never—" Her voice broke, and Miss Marple, hovering nearby, saw the girl's hands tremble. Not with guilt, she thought, but fear. Even the vicar, Leonard Clement, wasn't above suspicion. Village gossip recalled old disagreements over church funds, where the colonel, a major donor, had accused Leonard of mismanagement. All sorted now, the vicar insisted, but his spectacles slipped down his nose, betraying his unease. As Miss Marple left the vicarage, the village was cloaked in a soft morning mist. She strolled along the lane, her sensible shoes crunching on fallen leaves. Near the vicarage gate she paused, her sharp eyes catching a glint in the grass, a discarded sugar lump, half dissolved by dew. "How curious," she murmured, stooping to examine it. "Sugar in tea can mask so many things." She straightened, her mind turning over the possibilities. Arsenic, the constable had suggested, was likely the poison. Odorless, tasteless, it could dissolve easily in a lump of sugar delivered directly to the victim's cup. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting a steady companion. The village was alive with theories, each more fanciful than the last. At the post office, Miss Hartnell, the tea-shop owner, held court. "It's that nephew, mark my words," she declared. "Greedy sort after the colonel's money." Her friend, Miss Weatherby, disagreed. "No, it's the maid. Servants always know too much." Miss Marple, stopping by for a scone, listened with a polite smile, her mind cataloguing every word. Later, she visited the churchyard, where the vicarage garden bordered the ancient stone wall. The sugar lump nagged at her. Had it been dropped carelessly or placed deliberately? She recalled the colonel's habit of taking extra sugar, a quirk well known in the village. Someone who knew him well, she thought, would know just where to strike. That evening, as the village settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple hosted her knitting circle, a group of local women who met weekly to gossip and stitch. Mrs. Price Ridley, though subdued, attended, her fingers clumsy with her needles. Such a shock, she said, her voice tight. But the Colonel had enemies, didn't he? That artist, Lawrence Redding, was seen arguing with him last week. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. Lawrence, Lettice's suitor, was a new piece in the puzzle. As the women chatted, Miss Marple's thoughts wandered to the tea party. The Colonel's cup had been unique, larger, heavier, a gift from his late wife, he'd said. Had the poison been in the tea itself, or in something added? The sugar lump seemed too neat, too precise. And Anne's hesitation with the tongs, fear or something else? Miss Marple's needles paused. Human nature, she said softly, almost to herself. It's always in the small things. The village clock struck 9, and the knitting circle dispersed into the chilly night. Miss Marple remained by her fire, her mind weaving the threads of suspicion. Raymond's fidgeting, Mrs. Price Ridley's venom, Lettice's tears, Anne's fear, the vicar's unease. Each was a clue, a knot to be untangled. And somewhere, in the everyday routines of St. Mary Mead, lay the truth about a cup of poison. Chapter 3. Clues Among the China. The days following Colonel Prothero's death draped St. Mary Mead in a quiet unease, like a fog that refused to lift. The village, so accustomed to the gentle hum of routine, morning milk deliveries, the clatter of teacups at Miss Hartnell's tea shop, the chatter of children by the green, now buzzed with a different energy. Whispers of murder wove through every conversation, and eyes darted suspiciously at neighbors who had once been friends. Yet life went on, as it always did, and Miss Jane Marple, with her knitting needles and her unerring knack for seeing what others missed, was at the heart of it all. By midweek, the investigation had settled into a rhythm. Inspector Slack, with his brusque manner and ever-present notebook, had turned the vicarage into a hive of activity, questioning and re-questioning the tea-party guests. Miss Marple, though dismissed by the inspector as a meddlesome spinster, was sought out by the villagers for her gentle wisdom. "You've a way of seeing things, Miss Marple," said Miss Hartnell over a pot of Darjeeling at her tea shop. "It's that nephew, isn't it? Young Raymond, after the Colonel's fortune." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking as she worked on a pale blue shawl. "People are quick to judge, my dear, but appearances can deceive. Like that business with the curate in Nether Wallop. Everyone thought him guilty, but it was the grocer all along." She sipped her tea, her eyes scanning the tea shop's cozy interior, where villagers huddled over scones and speculation. The tea shop was a microcosm of St. Mary Mead's gossip, and Miss Marple listened intently. Miss Weatherby, a spinster with a penchant for melodrama, leaned forward. "I say, it's the maid, Anne. Servants always know too much, and she was pouring the tea." Another voice piped up, suggesting Lettice Prothero, whose engagement the Colonel had forbidden. "That girl's too quiet," said Mrs. Archer, the butcher's wife. "Hiding something, mark my words." Miss Marple noted it all, her mind sorting the chatter like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Determined to gather more clues, Miss Marple accepted an invitation from Lettice Prothero to visit Old Hall, the Colonel's imposing residence. "I could use the company," Lettice had said, her voice trembling over the telephone. "It's so empty without Father." Miss Marple, sensing an opportunity, arrived at the grand house that afternoon, her sensible hat tilted against the autumn breeze. Old Hall was a rambling affair of dark oak beams and ivy-clad walls, its windows glinting like watchful eyes. Lettice greeted her at the door, her pale face framed by a soft scarf, her eyes red from crying. They settled in the drawing-room, where a fire crackled and family portraits glared down from the walls. Lettice poured tea from a silver pot, her hands steadier than at the vicarage. "I made it myself," she said with a faint smile. "No poison here, I promise." Miss Marple chuckled kindly, but her eyes roamed the room. A faint stain marred the colonel's favorite armchair, a heavy leather piece by the window. On the sideboard, a medicine bottle caught her attention, unlabeled, half-empty, tucked behind a vase. "Arsenic is so common in rat poison," she remarked casually, watching Lettuce's reaction. The girl paled. Father never used such things. He hated pests, but he left that to the gardeners. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. She steered the conversation to lighter topics, Lettuce's love of painting, her dreams of studying in Paris, but her mind was on the bottle. Arsenic, she knew, was not only in rat poison but also in certain tonics, prescribed for vitality in small doses. Had the colonel been taking such a remedy? Or had someone else acquired it? A red herring surfaced when Miss Marple overheard gossip about Lawrence Redding, Lettuce's artist suitor. At the post office, Tommy Pierce mentioned seeing Lawrence arguing with the colonel days before the tea party. "Heard him shout something about a scandal," Tommy said, polishing a letterbox. Curious, Miss Marple sought out Lawrence, who was painting by the river. He admitted the argument, his paintbrush pausing mid-stroke. The colonel dug up an old forgery charge, nothing serious, just a youthful mistake with a check. He threatened to tell Lettuce, ruin us. But I was in my studio when he died. Mrs. Archer saw me through the window. Miss Marple thanked him, noting his earnestness. A forgery scandal was motive enough, but his alibi seemed solid. Still, she wondered about his access to the vicarage kitchen, where the tea had been prepared. Had he slipped in unnoticed? She tucked the thought away, like a stitch held for later. With Griselda's permission, Miss Marple visited the vicarage kitchen the next morning. The room was a cheerful chaos of copper pots and drying herbs, but the teacups from the fatal tea party, now evidence, were locked in a cupboard. Inspector Slack allowed her a glance, grumbling about amateur sleuths. The cups bore no fingerprints save Anne's, as expected from her serving duties. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a stray thread, green, silken, clinging to the sugar bowl's rim. "How careless," she murmured, recognizing it from Mrs. Price Ridley's favorite shawl. Had the gossip been in the kitchen before the tea? Another clue emerged as Miss Marple retraced the garden path where Raymond claimed to have smoked. Near the back door, she found a scattering of cigarette ash, fresh enough to suggest he'd re-entered the house unnoticed. Interesting, she thought. He said he stayed outside, but ash doesn't lie. She recalled Raymond's fidgeting, his reluctance to touch his teacup after the colonel's collapse. Was it guilt or merely nerves? That evening, the village hall hosted a meeting to discuss the harvest festival, but the murder dominated the conversation. Accusations flew like sparks. Mrs. Price Ridley pointed a bony finger at Anne. That girl was too close to the tea. Anne, serving biscuits, flushed and stammered a denial. Raymond, slouched in a corner, snapped at Lettuce for weeping crocodile tears. The vicar, trying to restore calm, stirred his tea absent-mindedly, his spoon clinking loudly. Miss Marple, seated quietly, noticed how Anne avoided the sugar tongs, using her fingers instead. And the colonel's cup, she recalled, had been the only one with extra sugar. His peculiar habit, requested loudly at the tea. As the meeting ended, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting a pretext for observation. She approached Anne, who was clearing plates. "My dear, you seem troubled," she said gently. Anne hesitated, then whispered, "It's not just the vase. The colonel accused me of stealing a brooch from his study. I didn't, but I saw Mrs. Price Ridley there, snooping, the day before." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A brooch, a study, a snoop. Small threads, but they wove a pattern. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles a steady rhythm. The sugar lump by the gate nagged at her. Had it been dropped in haste, or placed to mislead? Arsenic in sugar would dissolve quickly, masking its bitterness in the Colonel's tea. But who had access to both the poison and the bowl? Mrs. Price Ridley's garden shed, Raymond's presence in the house, Anne's service, Lettice's motives, even the vicar's old disputes, all swirled in her mind. "It's like a village dance," she thought. "Everyone moves in circles, but one step is always out of place." As the clock struck 10, Miss Marple set down her knitting. The clues were mounting, but the truth remained elusive, hidden in the everyday. She recalled a case in Little Paddocks, where a sugar bowl had held the key to a similar crime. Patience, she told herself. The truth always comes out, like a stitch that finally holds. With that, she blew out her candle and retired, ready to unravel more of St. Mary Mead's secrets in the days to come. Chapter 4. Shadows of Suspicion. The fog that settled over St. Mary Mead seemed to mirror the murkiness of the mystery surrounding Colonel Prothero's death. It clung to the cobblestone lanes, muffled the church bells, and seeped into the conversations of villagers who now eyed one another with wary glances. By the end of the week, the initial shock of murder had given way to a restless unease, as if the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for the truth to emerge. Miss Jane Marple, however, remained as serene as her neatly tended rose garden, her knitting needles clicking like a metronome as she pieced together the puzzle of the poisoned tea. Inspector Slack, with his bulldog tenacity, had made a bold move. He arrested Raymond West, the Colonel's nephew, citing a newly discovered will that cut Raymond out of the inheritance entirely. "Motive as clear as day," Slack declared, his notebook snapping shut. "Greed and desperation. Classic recipe for murder." The village buzzed with the news, and at Miss Hartnell's tea shop, opinions were as plentiful as the scones. "Told you it was the nephew," Miss Weatherby said triumphantly, stirring her tea with vigor. "Those literary types are always unstable." But Miss Marple, sipping her Earl Grey in the corner, shook her head. "Too obvious, my dear," she murmured to herself. "Like that poacher in the Melchett case, everyone barked up the wrong tree." Determined to test her instincts, Miss Marple invited the key suspects to her cottage for an informal gathering, ostensibly to offer solace in troubled times. The parlor, with its chintz curtains and crackling fire, was a haven of comfort, its air sweetened by a vase of late chrysanthemums. Griselda arrived first, her auburn curls drooping with worry. "Poor Raymond," she said, sinking into an armchair. "He's no murderer, Miss Marple, but the inspector won't listen." Lettice followed, her pale face framed by a soft scarf, her eyes darting nervously. Mrs. Price Ridley swept in, her green shawl trailing like a banner of indignation. Anne, the vicarage maid, came reluctantly, her hands twisting in her apron. The vicar, Leonard, arrived last, his spectacles fogging from the chilly evening air. Miss Marple poured tea from her cherished Wedgwood pot, her movements deliberate as she observed her guests. "Such a trying time," she said gently, passing a plate of crumpets. "But talking together often brings clarity, don't you think?" The conversation began haltingly, with Griselda recounting the chaos of the tea party, and Leonard lamenting the stain on the vicarage's reputation. But Miss Marple steered the talk subtly, dropping questions like pebbles into a pond, watching the ripples. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to hold her tongue, complained of her aching joints. "My doctor prescribed a tonic, trace arsenic, you know, for vitality," she said, her voice sharp. "Perfectly safe, of course." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes gleaming behind her spectacles. Arsenic, even in medicinal doses, was a dangerous thread in this tapestry. She recalled the unlabeled bottle at Old Hall. Could it be connected? Lettice spoke dreamily of her future with Lawrence Redding, her fingers toying with a locket. "Father was so cruel about him," she said softly. "But I was with Griselda when the tea was served. I couldn't have done it." Her alibi was solid. Yet Miss Marple noted the locket's faint scratches, as if it had been opened and closed in haste. Anne, serving the crumpets, was silent until Miss Marple addressed her directly. "My dear, you mentioned that brooch in the Colonel's study. Did you see anyone else there?" Anne hesitated, her cheeks flushing. "Just Mrs. Price Ridley, ma'am, the day before. She was looking at his papers." Mrs. Price Ridley sputtered, her shawl slipping. "Nonsense. I was merely delivering a church pamphlet." The vicar, stirring his tea absent-mindedly, produced a new clue. "I found something odd in the study yesterday," he said, fishing a crumpled note from his pocket. "From the Colonel, demanding repayment of an old loan. Quite threatening, really." Miss Marple examined the note, her lips pursing. "Interesting, Vicar, but I suspect this is a distraction. The real key lies in the everyday." As the evening wore on, Miss Marple's mind worked like her knitting, weaving loose ends into a pattern. The sugar lump by the vicarage gate, the thread on the sugar bowl, the Colonel's extra sugar habit, all pointed to a calculated act. But new revelations emerged. Anne, emboldened by Miss Marple's kindness, confided later as they cleared the tea things. "It wasn't just the vase," she whispered. "The Colonel accused me of stealing his wife's brooch, said he'd have me arrested. But I saw it in his study, and Mrs. Price Ridley was there poking about. I swear I didn't take it." Miss Marple patted her arm. "I believe you, my dear. But tell me, did you handle the sugar bowl that day?" Anne nodded, her eyes wide. "Yes, but I only filled it. I didn't touch the lumps after." The old lady's mind clicked. The poison was likely in the sugar lump, not the tea, placed there by someone who knew the Colonel's preference. Red herrings began to unravel. Lawrence Redding's forgery turned out to be a youthful indiscretion, copying a painting, not a crime of malice. Miss Marple confirmed this with Mrs. Archer, who'd seen him painting that day. Raymond's disinheritance, too, was a bluff. A lawyer's letter found in Old Hall revealed the Colonel had no intention of changing his will. Misdirection, Miss Marple thought, like a conjurer's trick. She revisited the vicarage kitchen the next day, with Griselda's permission, to examine the sugar bowl again. The green thread was gone, likely swept away by the police, but its memory lingered. Mrs. Price Ridley's shawl, Anne's hesitation with the tongs, Raymond's ash by the door, all were threads in a tightening net. Miss Marple recalled the Colonel's cup, larger and heavier than the others, a perfect target for a poisoned lump. But who had the opportunity? Mrs. Price Ridley had been at the vicarage that morning, delivering her pamphlet. Raymond had re-entered the house. Anne had filled the bowl. Lettice had lingered near the table. Even the vicar, with his access to the kitchen, couldn't be ruled out. That afternoon, Miss Marple took her customary walk through the village, her sensible shoes crunching on fallen leaves. She paused by the churchyard, where the vicarage garden met the stone wall. A glint caught her eye, a tiny vial, half buried in the soil. She stooped, careful not to touch it, and recognized the shape, a medicine bottle, like the one at Old Hall. Arsenic, perhaps, she murmured, or a clever imitation. She alerted the constable, who retrieved it for analysis, but her mind was already racing ahead. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm. The clues were aligning, but the picture was still incomplete. The sugar lump was the key, she was certain. Dissolved in the Colonel's tea, it delivered the poison with surgical precision. Mrs. Price Ridley's tonic, her presence in the study, her grudge over the fence, all pointed to her. Yet Anne's fear, Raymond's secrecy, and Lettice's locket nagged at her. It's like a village quilt, she thought. Every patch tells a story, but only one holds the truth. As twilight fell, Miss Marple lit a candle, her mind turning to the final act. She would gather the suspects again, this time to unravel the mystery, before Inspector Slack's haste led to another mistake. The fog might cloak St. Mary Mead, but Miss Marple's clarity would pierce it, revealing the hand that had slipped poison into a cup of tea. Chapter 5. The Bitter Truth. The fog that had cloaked St. Mary Mead for days began to lift, as if the village itself sensed that the truth was near. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke, and the church bells chimed with a tentative hope. Miss Jane Marple, ever the calm center of the storm, had spent the week observing, listening, and knitting, her mind weaving the threads of Colonel Prothero's murder into a coherent pattern. Now, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, she prepared to unravel the mystery in the vicarage parlor, where the fatal tea party had taken place. The room, with its lace curtains and polished oak, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her gentle voice to lay bare the secrets hidden in its chintz and china. Miss Marple had requested the gathering under the guise of sharing new evidence, a pretext that drew the key figures back to the vicarage. Inspector Slack, though skeptical, agreed to attend, his notebook poised like a weapon. Griselda, her auburn curls pinned neatly, fussed over the tea tray, her nervous energy palpable. The vicar, Leonard, adjusted his spectacles, his face etched with worry. Raymond West, released on bail but still pale, slouched in a corner, his cufflinks glinting. Lettice Prothero, her eyes red but resolute, clutched her locket. Mrs. Price Ridley swept in, her green shawl a defiant banner, her lips pursed in indignation. Anne, the maid, hovered by the door, her hands twisting in her apron. The air was thick with anticipation, like the moment before a storm breaks. Miss Marple settled into her familiar chintz armchair, her knitting bag at her feet, her lavender dress as unassuming as her demeanor. "Dear friends," she began, her voice soft but commanding attention, "murder is a terrible thing, born of desperation or malice, yet often hidden in the everyday. Colonel Prothero died here in this very room, from arsenic in his tea. But it was not the tea itself that carried the poison. It was in the sugar lump he alone requested, laced with deadly precision." The room stirred. Inspector Slack's pencil paused. Griselda gasped, her teacup rattling. "The sugar lump," she whispered. "But how?" Miss Marple's needles clicked once, a deliberate pause. The Colonel's habit of taking extra sugar was well known. Someone in this room, or with access to it, knew this and used it to their advantage. The arsenic, odorless and tasteless, was mixed into a sugar lump, placed in the bowl, and delivered to his cup. It dissolved quickly, leaving no trace but death. "But who?" Inspector Slack demanded, his voice sharp. "We've been over this. West had motive, the maid, served the tea." Miss Marple raised a hand, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Patience, Inspector. Let us consider each in turn." She turned to Anne, who shrank under her gaze. "You served the tea, my dear, and filled the sugar bowl that morning. But your fear was not of guilt, was it? It was fear of the Colonel's accusations, about a stolen brooch, a broken vase. You saw something, though, didn't you? In his study, the day before." Anne nodded, her voice barely audible. "Mrs. Price Ridley, ma'am. She was there, looking at his papers. I told you." Mrs. Price Ridley bristled, her shawl slipping. "Slander? I was delivering a pamphlet, nothing more." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Raymond. "And you, Mr. West. Your uncle threatened to cut you off, and that will seem damning. Yet it was a bluff, wasn't it? A lawyer's letter confirmed he hadn't changed it. Your cigarette ash by the back door told me you re-entered the house, but your hesitation with your teacup was nerves, not guilt." Raymond flushed, his fingers twitching. "I didn't do it, I swear." "I believe you," Miss Marple said gently, then turned to Lettuce. "And you, my dear. Your father's control over your life, your love for Lawrence Redding, it gave you reason to resent him. But you were with Griselda, talking of fashions, when the tea was served. Your locket, though, those scratches suggest you've been hiding something small, perhaps a keepsake, but not poison." Lettuce clutched the locket, her eyes welling. "It's just a picture of Lawrence. Nothing else." The vicar cleared his throat, holding up the threatening note. "What about this, Miss Marple? The Colonel's loan demand. It could point to me." Miss Marple smiled. "A distraction, Vicar. Like so many things in this case, Lawrence's old forgery, Raymond's will, even Anne's brooch. Red herrings, all of them, meant to cloud the truth." Her gaze settled on Mrs. Price Ridley, who stiffened. "And now, we come to you," Miss Marple said, her voice as soft as ever but carrying a weight that silenced the room. "You, Mrs. Ridley, had a petty grudge over a garden fence. But it was more than that, wasn't it? The Colonel discovered your secret. A small matter to some, but ruinous to you. You've been dipping into the church flower fund, using his donations to cover your debts. He confronted you, threatened to expose you to the village. Your reputation, your standing, it would have crumbled." Mrs. Price Ridley's face turned ashen. "Preposterous! I'd never." "But you did," Miss Marple continued, relentless yet kind. "You mentioned your doctor's tonic. Trace arsenic, you said, for vitality. A bottle like the one in the Colonel's study, perhaps. And your garden shed, so proudly stocked with rat poison, also arsenic-based. You were at the vicarage that morning, delivering your pamphlet. You slipped into the kitchen, unnoticed, and laced a sugar lump with arsenic, knowing the Colonel's habit. The green thread from your shawl, caught on the sugar bowl, betrayed you, and Anne saw you in the study, snooping for evidence he might have against you. The room was silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Mrs. Price Ridley's hands trembled, her shawl falling to the floor. "He'd ruin me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Those funds, I meant to repay them. He was so cruel, so smug. I only meant to quiet him." Tears streamed down her face as she collapsed into a chair, the confession spilling like the tea that had doomed the Colonel. Inspector Slack, for once speechless, signaled to the constable. "Take her in," he said gruffly, but his eyes held a grudging respect for Miss Marple. As Mrs. Price Ridley was led away sobbing, the room exhaled. Griselda rushed to embrace Lettuce, who wept with relief. Raymond slumped, his tension easing. Anne, tears in her eyes, murmured thanks to Miss Marple. The vicar adjusted his spectacles, murmuring, "Extraordinary. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. "Human nature, you see," she said to no one in particular. "It's always in the small things. The thread, the sugar lump, the glance that lingers too long. People are much the same everywhere." As the guests dispersed, the vicarage parlor regained its warmth, the stain on the rug a fading memory. Miss Marple declined Griselda's offer of another cup, citing a need to tend her roses. She stepped into the twilight, the village settling back into its gentle rhythm. The church bells rang out clear and bright, and the fog was gone, leaving St. Mary Mead to its quiet peace. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a steady companion. The mystery was solved, the truth laid bare, but she felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served. Like a good stitch, she thought, it holds when done right. She set down her needles, blew out her candle, and smiled into the darkness, ready for whatever secrets the village might whisper next.